Hello, and welcome to Transforming Worlds. Join me today in a conversation with Dr. Elizabeth Sawin. She's the director of the Multisolving Institute. Beth is an expert on multi-solving, actions that address equity, climate change, health, well-being, and economic vitality as integrated issues. She developed this concept after studying bright spots around the world where people created systems change by building connections across silos. In 2021, Beth founded the Multisolving Institute to share this research and to develop tools tailored for multi-solving. Beth has dedicated her career to the theory and practice of creating change in complex systems. Prior to founding the Multisolving Institute, she co-founded the think tank Climate Interactive to develop tools for grappling with the complexity of the climate system. Beth writes and speaks about multi-solving and leadership in complex systems. Her new book, Multisolving: Creating Systems Change in a Fractured World, is just out and is a highly recommended read. Beth has a fascinating view as to how we can look at issues as a stacked problem and work together to create the change we want to see in the world. Join us in an amazing conversation. So, hello and welcome, Elizabeth Beth Sawin, to Transforming Worlds. We're excited to have you here and to welcome you. How are you today?
Well, I'm looking forward to the conversation. I have been for a while. We're recording this just a couple days after the US presidential election, so I'm absorbing that. And I lead a company. I'm a parent of young adults. I live in a community. So in all those ways, I've been doing a lot of listening and holding space with people. So I think I'm in a reflective space today as well.
Yeah. Many of these processes also lead us to become multi-solvers in new ways. But before we can do that, we need to feel into ourselves and with each other into what is happening in our context. So, yeah, we're with you on that.
Yeah, thank you.
If you look at what is happening around you and with your work, how would you describe the transformation that you're going through?
Well, I think a lot about this moment as being a moment and actually kind of a long and ongoing battle, I think is a word, between two worldviews. Um, and in my book that I think we'll talk about this morning, I had to really struggle with how to capture that idea. And I ended up borrowing words from other thinkers. The uh, the eco-theologian Thomas Berry talks about a worldview he calls collection of objects. So that sees the world in very broken into pieces ways. It sees people as separate from one another, people as separate from nature, and it sees safety and survival coming out of the power of domination. Like the strategy to be safe is to dominate someone or something else. And so that's the worldview that brought us colonialism, empire, patriarchy, white supremacy. And I think we can see examples, in daily life and world affairs and
Mhm.
everything in between of that. The other worldview I end up referring to in kind of a shorthand as a web of relationship worldview. So that worldview, I think the words kind of speak for themselves, but it acknowledges this fundamental interconnection, which of course planetary science and astrophysics and everything in between teaches us about, and also indigenous knowledge systems and wisdom traditions. And we see examples of that too, companies that are nurturing and cooperative, educational systems that are learner directed, organic agriculture systems that work with the soil. And so the sense that I have about the transformation going on is moments of choice between those two organizing systems. And to some extent the question of which one is going to dominate for the coming decades.
Yeah, beautiful question. And adding to that is the question how we will do that. Which side of ourselves will we honor? The the need for control and security and rules and survival, or the intuitive, organic, playful, thriving side of ourselves that allows everything around us to thrive. And we're so scared of that. It's incredible. We've lost with it, and we seem to be scared to reconnect with that universal power, that eco power, really, that is within us as well. So, how does your work with multi-solving tie into this dilemma that you're talking about, this duality?
Yeah. Well, in some ways, and the way most people discover multi-solving is much more pragmatic and less philosophical than where we entered.
Yes.
So multi-solving, we just define that as any action or investment that solves more than one problem or addresses more than one need at the same time. And so an example could be weatherizing homes, which reduces their energy use and so helps fight climate change, but provides good jobs for the building construction trades, reduces the costs for people living in the home so they have more of their paycheck for food and medicine and education, and has been shown again and again to improve the health of people in buildings that have been made just healthier, and so reduced costs for the health system. And so, there's many, many, many examples, but that theme of one action, multiple benefits. Um, the thing is, and where that connects to this transformation for me is uh, most people want those win-win-wins, but what we discover is that to accomplish them, we have to relate to each other differently. Because in general, they emerge from people reaching across boundaries that typically exist in our societies. So it might be, well, in that home energy example, health systems and health systems and energy efficiency ministries are collaborating. Maybe they're doing it with also programs for senior citizens. So those are people who may not talk normally in the course of their daily work. Um, Sometimes it looks like community groups partnering with businesses or partnering with government agencies. And so we were talking about a web of relationship. Well, there it is, right? Like to accomplish these projects that in general people are very excited about, actually asks us to relate to each other in a different way. And so the advantages of multi-solving, we definitely celebrate those accomplishments for the climate and for people's pocketbooks. But we also say it gives people an experience, and they may not have had many, of relating to one another in healthier, more interconnected, more whole ways. And I think that creates a kind of muscle memory that people take with them into other situations. Uh, and so
Hmm.
as we think about scale of transformation and how does it spread, I think that's one mechanism.
Wow, that's so inspiring. It's really beautiful. Especially in a world in which we feel so disempowered. We feel like the problems are bigger than we are, and we're wondering how do we create the critical mass in order to you know, have coping mechanisms to deal with those problems. And I really like the concept and the notion that you bring about in your work that you say most people think that making problems smaller makes them easier to solve, where in actual fact that is not the case. So how do you see that through your work?
Yeah. Well, for some problems, that is the case. And so I always say to people, if that's true, if you're getting the results you want by focusing narrowly on a problem, then by all means do it. Um, but in general, the problems that are remaining when we've done that, so
Mm.
problems like global climate change, problems like a growing gap between the rich and the poor, problems like chronic health and health equity. Um, I look around at the world and those don't seem to be yielding to the approaches we're taking. And I believe that's because they're a different type of problem. They're a type of problem that, as you say, gets easier to solve when you bundle the parts together. And people often, when I say this, uh, people who are working really hard on big problems are like, wait, I'm working on health equity, and now you're saying I have to tackle climate change too? Like I'm already exhausted. I already don't have enough resources. But what I think people are missing when they feel that is that when we bundle problems together, we also bundle our creativity and our resources to address them. And so that might mean three budgets align because there's a solution, um, an investment or a policy that could advance three goals, three sets of voters, three sets of people to mobilize in the streets because you've found a spot where these common interests meet.
Mm.
Um, so that's what we see as we look for bright spots of multi-solving around the world. Um, One of the advantages is the power to kind of overcome either vested interests or the things that hold systems stuck and keep them from changing.
Have you seen a difference across cultures?
Um, it's such an interesting question. Early on in our research, we were funded by a US health foundation to look for examples of multi-solving around the world. They want us to do a global scan. Um, uh, just we focus on countries that were either English speaking or Spanish speaking, so not really a global scan, but quite broad compared to the United States or North America. Um, and we found examples everywhere we looked. They were at all scales. So some were neighborhood projects or within a single organization, like a health system. Some were national or multinational. Yeah, they were in cities, they were in small towns, they were in rural areas. They touched transportation, they touched food. Um, and so we came back to that foundation saying two things. One is we see multi-solving everywhere we look. We also said it's the exception, not the rule. And
Oh,
we could talk about why, although it's possible everywhere, it is also rare. Um, and the last thing we saw was how place specific each solution was. So you asked about culture. So it in different ways fit the culture, it fit the needs, it also fit the geography, it fit the history, the past. And this was made us stop and think because that initial funder, their goal was to find these multi-solving examples and then replicate them in the US. And that's what we set off to do in that project. And at the end, we were like, that won't work.
yeah,
Because each solution fits, it is fit for its place and its history. But what we saw, because we looked across so many different, very, very different projects, there was this feeling of things in common, and they weren't the specifics, right? It wasn't, because it was cycling paths and urban orchards, and they looked totally different, but it was the attitudes and the approaches.
yeah,
So now we talk about that as the multi-solving way. Like the thing in common is a way of being and relating, not a what. And we believe that's the um, supporting the conditions that promote that way of being. That's the way to get more multi-solving in the world if that's a goal for someone.
yeah, yeah. One of my favorite designers is a Canadian a designer. His name is Bruce Mao, and Bruce Mao has created a series of principles for design. And one of my favorites is when he says, "New wicked problems require new wicked teams," which means
Hmm.
we have to address complexity with diversity. Let's bring all the people to the table because how can we face complexity from a single perspective? It's just going to come back and show you other symptoms and other issues that you have not considered quite simply because you can't. I mean, we're limited in that
Yeah.
way. And the reason for my question about the culture is because I'm originally from Argentina. I'm 52. I've lived 26 years in Argentina and 26 years in the Netherlands, half my life in both sides of the ocean. And the culture within Argentina is much more linked to the we and to what the group needs, whereas Europe, and particularly Northern Europe, is much more linked to the I. What do I
Hmm.
need, and how can I use the group to support those things, which also leads to a collaborative effort albeit from a different point of view.
Hmm.
And indeed, if you try to bring those two together and find sort of established methods to collaborate, it's very difficult. But the moment we all just feel into our emotions and breathe together, we are often worried about the same things. We're often
Hmm.
concerned about the same things, hopeful about the same kinds of futures. And then we can put the cultural aspect aside, the idiosyncrasies aside, and start looking for ways in which it's no longer about having the single truth, but finding for ways and tasks to contribute to the whole. And it seems to me that that's what multi-solving does so beautifully, is that we accept the fact that the problem is multi-layered and complex, and that actually bringing uh, people into the multi-solving endeavor is not going to add more complexity. On the contrary, it's going to make us resilient to face the complexity. But it is counterintuitive.
Counterintuitive uh, to those of us who've been trained in more linear models
Which is most of
of
us.
which is most of us. And yeah, I mean, I'm trained. I have a PhD in molecular biology, and I was definitely trained in that method of break this problem down. I wanted to study a whole organism, and my advisor wanted me to study a molecule, and both give insight into into the organism, but it's different questions and you get different answers.
Yes, yeah.
So
And
it's
because it's,
counterintuitive, and sorry, but it's also it's important to say it requires resources. It requires time to listen to each other, to cultivate that curiosity, to build trust. So one of the main um, criteria that we see for successful multi-solving is nurturing trusting relationships across these silos. And so an obstacle, I mentioned we see multi-solving everywhere, but it's rare. One of the obstacles is people feel pressed for time. If projects are funded by grants or by government programs, they feel, that's not part, the grant is to get the result, right? The grant is to create that urban orchard, but not for the listening session that brought everyone together to do it. So one thing we really emphasize is we talk about that as the unseen layer of multi-solving. If it were a plant, it's growing beneath the surface, but the health of everything else depends on that.
yeah. And have you tried it with groups of, for example, school children or elderly or, in other situations that are not necessarily related to deadlines and grants and projects, but that are more about, sharing the conversation?
Well, I mean, it's important to say that multi-solving is not like some new thing that I or anyone else dreamed up, right? It's my grandmother was a multi-solver, small farmers who figure out, that the leftover milk from the cows is good food for the pigs, right? They're working in a way across silos to have more integrated systems. Um, and as things get more difficult, as we move into more shocks from climate change, for instance, I think we're seeing more multi-solving because it is what you're forced to do when your resources are small and your problems are large and growing.
Yeah.
So it's not the realm of just professionalized people in fancy conference centers at all.
No, no, for sure. And
Yeah.
is it you're referring to scarcity as a kind of precondition to having to make do and therefore trying to do three for the price of one to avoid the birds and stones metaphor?
Hmm, right.
Um, so do you need to have constraints in order to multi-solve?
I don't know if you need to, probably not. And in fact, I think if we look at, for instance, indigenous knowledge systems, um, multi-solving is just a reflection of a worldview in some cases.
Yes.
So I don't think it's always a response to an emergency. And a lot of the examples that we've looked at have been responses to emergencies. I mentioned home weatherization. We looked at a
Yes.
project in New Zealand, and the seed for that was the 2008 financial crisis, and the building sector was having a jobs crisis. And so that project started in a response to a crisis. We looked at a walk to school program in the UK, and that was in response to increasingly worrisome rates of children who weren't getting sufficient physical activity in their
Mm,
day.
yeah.
So again, it was a crisis. But in that case, they found ways to um, reduce dependence on cars, improve air quality, reduce congestion, reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. So an interesting thing is that a crisis in one area, if it's met with a multi-solving idea, can lead to benefits in multiple areas that maybe weren't as much of a crisis, but could still benefit.
Mhm. What are your sources of inspiration, Beth?
Hmm. Well, multi-solvers themselves, I think probably would be the top of the list. Our approach has been to look for bright spots. So although this is so hard to do, we gravitate to people who are doing it anyway.
Yeah.
And we includes a great team of social scientists who have done interviews with multi-solvers about how they think and how they work. So that's a source of inspiration. I mentioned I'm a biologist, so living systems, of course, are constantly, our body is balancing multiple goals all the time. I'm also a gardener, and so that's an experience of multi-solving where you're in partnership with the soil and the water and the plants, and it's not a command and control process at all. It's an experience of being in a web of relationships.
Yeah. And so you say multi-solvers. So for our audience, what it makes a multi-solver are in the title.
Yeah. Um, well, two things about that. First of all, I run into many people who work in this way and never realized there was a word for it.
Mm,
I talk about multi-solving as a hidden movement sometimes, that people are often improvising and making it up as they go, and they don't necessarily feel like they're part of a community of practice of people working in a similar way. And so one advantage of using this word multi-solving is it gives people a way to see that is something unique about what I do. And also the potential to learn from one another. Because most of us, our communities of practice are more content focused, right? Like I'll go to the conference on pedestrian walkability, and you'll go to the conference on community gardens, and we would never meet. But if we go to a conference on multi-solving and it's how do we build trust, how do we work across silos, the content fades to the background and it's the way. So I think an advantage of and part of why I wrote the book is sort of a signal to the all the multi-solvers in the world, like there's a group here. You are part of it. You may not have known about it.
yeah. I
Um,
experienced something similar with transformation design.
uh-huh.
So people don't realize that they're designers, especially because design can be a bit elitist and it's linked to the craftsmanship and to the creative endeavor. So
Hmm.
people who, when you're telling them you're a designer too, they're like, well, but I can't draw,
Right.
or they'll say something to that avail. And actually, everything is designed, and we did it. So
Yeah.
we're all designers,
Yeah.
and very much in the same way as everyone has the latent potential to be a multi-solver. It seems to me that to really become a multi-solver, there is a little bit of a barrier or a need for daring. How is that from your point of view?
Yeah. I think a lot about is there a kind of a personality type who gravitates to this work? So I think there is daring or courage because it's an unconventional way of working. There's also some humility. You
Yeah.
start with the assumption that you can't accomplish this alone and that you need partners. Um, we find a lot of curiosity, and we actually say too much attachment to your identity as an expert is a barrier to multi-solving.
Yeah.
We all need to bring our expertise, right? So if it's a collaboration of climate experts and public health officials and community leaders. Each of them has knowledge and lived experience, and they need to bring everything they know. But I'm sure you know these people, right, who are just so curious about what they don't know. That is a key ingredient, I think, for multi-solving.
Yeah, it's beautiful. There's a well-known Dutch designer called Marcel Wanders who got sent away from design school for not being good enough as a designer, and he's one of the leading designers in the world today. And he, years ago at a design conference, he said, trust your talent. It's not going to go away for lack of use. It's just going to follow
Uh-huh.
you into every room you walk in. You
Uh-huh.
just don't have to put it right in front of you because it's not going to let you be able to see what's there. And I
Hmm.
think that's what you're saying as well. Lead with curiosity. And of course, your expertise is going to be there. It's not going anywhere because you've
Right.
already developed it. So we need to develop the other side as well of saying, where can we find each other? How do we connect to one another? How do we relate? How are things interlinked? And then from there, our expertise will know what to do.
Yeah, I love that
Yeah.
story. That
Yeah.
fits very much my observations.
And it's like
Uh,
cells in the body in many ways. Some of our bodily cells are not specialized at all. I mean, including neurons. So once we actually use them for something and tell them what it is that we want with our hearts, then the neurons specialize. I think that's really beautiful in the human body as well, and animal bodies as well. That when we know what to do is when the specialization actually comes into action and actually gets meaningful because it knows that's the intention, that's the way, that's what needs to happen. That's how I connect and relate to the rest of the cells.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that kind of power for organic self-organization, in my field, we call it adaptive capacity sometimes, the ability to respond when conditions shift, is another power of multi-solving. Um, One story that I tell about this a lot is I was part of a project that was giving small grants to community groups to do community revitalization, like $5,000 grants.
Mhm.
And the grants went out just before the lockdowns at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. And one group, their initial plan was to do a park, like improvement of a neighborhood park. Um, so that's what the money was, that was their idea. Suddenly they're in lockdown and they notice that senior citizens in the neighborhood don't know how to use their cell phones to make a telehealth
Mhm.
appointment. And so they pivoted, they reorganized very quickly, and they were doing training sessions on people's front porches. Like, here's how you make these appointments that you need to have. So there's no way we, as the leaders of the program, could have anticipated a pandemic, requested proposals. What would you do if there was but there because this was a healthy system connected by trusting relationships, it had that ability to move into an unexpected situation. And that can be when there's a new need or a crisis. We see it with climate shocks where communities mobilize to take care of each other. It can be when there's an opportunity, a new funding stream is announced. If you already have those trusting relationships, you can put forward your partnership idea so much more easily than you're like, oh, well, there is a potential, but I don't know anybody in that I could partner with. And before you can even assemble a team, the window to apply is closed. So it goes in both ways, preparation for risk and shock, but preparation to move into opportunities.
Yeah. And it seems that both are question led, right? So you have to have this curiosity to ask the questions and to break down the dominant narrative, because often the dominant narrative is like, well, that's the only way to do it. But
Yeah.
how
Yeah,
does
I
that
guess that's
work?
the common, like constant question of what's needed now, and what's true now. What are the conditions now? And because you have built these networks or partnerships across sectors and silos, um, you have more collective intelligence, right? More sensing elements. Like, this is what I'm hearing from the community. This is what I'm hearing from the national government. This is what I'm noticing as a scientist in the data. None of us have all of those perspectives, but what facilitates them joining into making sense is the relationships amongst people.
And what happens if you don't have them? I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic of loneliness, of self-isolation, of people putting themselves down even before they begin.
Yeah, that I mean, it's the active work of cultivating those connections as a theory of change. Um, and this is difficult and again is countercultural. If you think of nonprofits who apply for grants to do good work, usually the questions are, what are you going to do? What will happen? How many lives will be saved? How many trees will be planted? Um, if your strategy is we're going to build trusting relationships across sectors and silos, I have the confidence to say you can predict that those outcomes of health and vibrancy, you'll get them, but exactly what they'll look like, you can't predict. In systems theory, that's the idea of emergence, that when you change the connections in a system, you create novel behavior.
Yes.
The thing about emergence is you can't control it and you can't predict it. You can just create the conditions for it. And so if we're talking about different worldviews clashing, it's another example. If you're saying, I trust that if this system is wired together in a more healthy way, it will improve these things we care about. And the person with the resources to help you accomplish that doesn't have anywhere to write that in their report or their recommendation, right? They're like, but how many trees? It's like two different conversations that aren't meeting very well. Um, One thing we try to help multi-solvers do is learn to see the stories where creating new connections have created the change they're working toward, and being able to tell those stories gives you more confidence to keep doing what you're doing and helps you bring your investors and supporters along.
Yeah, because I was going to ask, what is the role of mimicry, right? What is the role, to use it on a more biological way, but of role modeling? Because if you look at startups and venture capitalism, I mean, no one knows where it's going either, and somehow they manage to get funded. So there is also this kind of leap of faith within that world, but it's more of it's almost like a betting game that they're in, right? So they go into these dragon dens and they present their plans, which, like, I mean, what's the use of plans? I mean, look at the context. I mean, the world is a mess. What are you planning
Right,
for, right?
right.
So they're not using adaptive or responsive ways of being, and still they're managing to convince others to believe in them and fund their projects. Is there something we can learn from that world?
Hmm. I don't know if I know enough about that world uh, to answer that. It's an interesting
Okay. So
question to me.
oftentimes it appears to me that they're looking at trends. So they're like, okay, we're going to hop on this trend. That's projected to grow. I mean, obviously the growth metaphor is very present in a capitalistic context, but they're actually using the systemic view to say these trends are happening and we're going to be a part of that. And we're going to lift with those by, being part of that movement. And in emergence, the volatility of the movement is as big as it is within the startup world. So it seems to me that having a sense of the context and being able to see it as an opportunity is part of the answer, right? So it's saying we as applicants for grants, we want to be part of this thing that is emerging in society. And we want to give, I'm going to use a difficult word because that's what's coming, but we want to give Gestalt, which is
Hmm.
a German word, but it just means give shape, give form. That's the very essence of transformation, to go across in order to give form, transform,
Yeah.
new structures beyond the now. And that's why multi-solving is fabulous, because it allows us to transcend the level of thinking. But this anticipatory capacity that the startup and VC world plays with could be quite interesting as well, to help us show a vision of the future that we want to move towards. Because behaviorally, once we start, as animals that we are, behaviorally, we are going to show the behaviors that align with that vision, and therefore initiate the momentum and the vitality for that which we are envisioning, which is
Yeah.
quite simply what startups do. And then they try and
Yeah.
profit from it, which wouldn't be our case, but
Yeah. Well, that makes me think of a few things.
okay.
I think we should be comparing not just the startups and multi-solving projects, but also the holders of venture capital with the
Yes.
holders of philanthropy. Like, I think those are different cultures.
Mm,
And I think the the venture capital culture may actually be more suited to make these um, leaps, right? That if we set the conditions right, we have faith that we'll move in the direction we intend to move.
mm,
Maybe philanthropy has more to learn. And I know there are now hybrids, there's a mission related investment and there are experiments like
yeah.
that. But I think the world could benefit from more of that. Um, when the other idea that was coming to mind for me is um, a concept we try to share with multi-solvers of coherence. So when you talked about kind of aligning all the parts of a mission, um, we talk about vision. So what is the world that we're working toward? We talk about values. And we talk about simple rules or organizing principles as three things that, if across all the parts of your effort, you're worried less about the details and more about are we aligned with those principles. We see that as the way to scale and the way to improvise. If we don't know what's coming next, we can't rely on these A, B, C, D steps, but we can always know our vision and our values, and that will tell us what to do in a moment of um, questions or concerns or confusion.
Yeah. Wow.
Do
Uh,
you, I mean, do you see that in your thinking on transformation and
for
design?
sure, because
Yeah.
those are designerly endeavors. So design necessitates an intention. So you
Hmm.
can't design if you don't know what you're going to do, right? So it's
Right.
we have a bias to action as designers. And so one of the things we learn because we have the bias to action is that there is no action without reflection and there's no reflection without action. So
Hmm.
it's like the yin and yang of design, right? So
Right.
if you're going to design, the first thing is to understand what does the world look like today and what do we want to transform it into?
Hmm.
And then the second act of design is what are the vehicles that are conducive to achieving that desired outcome, that design outcome,
Uh-huh.
because necessarily it has impact. So we start to understand what that might look like and how do we need to keep iterating in the design process in order to bring us closer and not further away from that desired outcome that we're aiming to achieve in full knowledge that there are 1,000 ways to get there. So
Hmm.
that's why I write on Substack, and my Substack is called Pathways to Transformation because there are unbelievably many ways of making transformation happen. And that's why this podcast is called Transforming Worlds, because each one of you that I speak with is transforming their world. And through you, the world of all of us is transforming. So this concept of vision, values, and principles that you just mentioned is very similar in my work. There is no use of speaking about principles ahead of aligning the vision and the values, to use your terminology. So
Hmm.
first we talk about what are we aiming to create and from what place?
Hmm.
What is preferable? What is the future that we are creating? In full knowledge that within the design endeavor, there will always be entropy. In other words,
Uh-huh.
unintended consequences. Because,
Uh-huh.
as Albert Einstein said, we cannot foresee what is going to happen next from the level of knowledge and intelligence that we have now. So how could we even? I mean, we don't even try, right? But we
Right.
do try to bring in the desired outcome into the creation of the form so that it can at least be as responsive as possible
Yeah.
as opposed to reactive.
And I guess what keeps you on course are those cycles of action and reflection.
Yes. And more design is also increasingly, luckily, more and more participative. So I also
Uh-huh.
worked in infrastructural engineering, And I remember asking my colleagues the question, like, how often do you call the clients? And they said, well, never. I said, how come? And he said, no, well, they call us, we're the experts. And then doing participatory design, working with them to understand how do we include the people who are going to use whatever it is that we create in the process of creating. I said it in a podcast recently. Uh, we jokingly say within the design discipline that there are two trades, two professions that speak about the people we serve as our users. Those are designers and drug dealers, right? So we have to bring the human aspect, the life aspect into design in order for it to be conducive to more life. But this idea of systems thinking in design is fairly new. Luckily, more and more we are being exposed to that um, as some of the sort of more life-oriented systems thinkers become more visible in the world. So,
Mhm.
being coming from Latin America, of course, the work of Maturana and Varela is known
Of
to me.
course. Yeah.
But more and more people are increasingly talking about breach of Capra, and we're finding your work, and people are publishing about these things. I think that's at the very least making us think. When we have that cycle of reflection, these considerations are being met. Jeremy Lent, with
Yeah.
the work of Nora Bateson, who I adore, really provoking us to like, what are you doing really? And
Yeah.
who is it really helping,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think I'm excited for more bi-directional learning because I would say in our work, when we interview multi-solvers about what's difficult, again and again, they often use the words looking for signal,
Mm.
looking for how to see the change that they're creating. Um, and we're often surprised they feel confused about this because from one step removed, we see, oh, well, there's all these new ideas, and those people who weren't connected are now connected. But I think people have absorbed a vision of what change is or a definition that it's very linear, it's very direct. We have to do it ourselves or we can't count it. Like if we didn't do this single-handedly, then
Yeah.
we can't report it. So it just strikes me in those cycles you're describing in partnership with the people who will use the things you're designing. Um, I guess I'm wondering, are there insights for multi-solvers about how to see what's happening and what's changing?
Thank you for that. So I'm going to challenge you as a scientist. It's a hobby I have. So I'm a very spiritual person, perhaps colored by my Andean culture, where I come from originally. And in the spiritual world, there is increasing the belief that humanity is rising in awareness, and that as we do this, we are starting to understand deeply, feel deeply that there are more modes of knowing and more modes of learning, and particularly that learning is not only achieved through suffering, and that
Mm,
we are
mm,
now at the cusp of a sort of that is dawning on us that we can also learn through enjoyment. We can
mhm,
also learn through the vital force that we are as stewards of the planet, as stewards of our fellow brothers and sisters in the animal realm. And so, really coming to a deep understanding in this sort of bidirectional learning that um, what you said, the pleasure of multi-solving is equally creative in its force, in its power, in its not from a dominion perspective, but in its ability to channel this as is multi-solving to avoid the worst.
mhm.
And I am very hopeful that this is the case. I try to look for that in other people. That's how I found you as well.
Uh-huh.
Um, so yeah, it's a challenge. I know that you come from a scientific background, you've mentioned reductionistic thinking. It's helped us a lot because it's a fractal universe, right? So everything's in bits and pieces. So if you understand the part, you get bigger understanding of the whole. But by
Right.
embracing the whole, we can also see that we just need to navigate to that space where we are part of everything, and that that is our birthright, and that that is okay, and that there is something um it's like we've already been born as multi-solvers. We're already a part of something bigger, and all we have to do is remember, become members. Again, these are the words of Neil Donald Walsh, wrote a series of books that are called The Conversations with God. But what he says is if we remember, we re-link,
Yeah.
we relate, we become compassionate, uh, feel the pain that is passion with one another, feel the joy that is passion with one another, and then we can transcend, which is the whole point of transformation, is transcendence, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think multi-solving relates to that, but I don't know, perhaps this sounds very fluffy and woo-woo, probably does.
No, no, I resonate with a lot of it. My worldview is very influenced by thinking about fractals, partly as the mechanism for scaling what we're learning. So that resonates. I think part of what I see multi-solvers experiencing, I haven't thought about it in this way as being related to transformation yet, but I think another difficult thing is that people are intuitively trying to work in a way that's about wholes and about repairing fractures,
Mm-hmm.
but we're still um, caught up enough in these systems that divide things into parts that the sustenance people need, even just literally,
Yeah.
like to raise the money to pay their staff, um, they have to interface with a world that is very linear, that is very siloed and compartmentalized. And so they're trying to tell stories out of what you're describing, the joyfulness, the playfulness, the feeling of interconnection, the power. And then they have to fill out a grant report that doesn't have any space to talk about that. Um, and yeah, I think is a big challenge. And I think it erodes people's confidence or even limits
Yes.
our ability to see what we're accomplishing because we're being judged by metrics where our work doesn't make any sense.
Yes.
And it gets very confusing.
Yeah. And disheartening. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yes. For sure. Yeah. I think that must be within your community one of the big issues. Like um you feel alone in the endeavors, right? So you feel misunderstood. But it's not. It's just we're disaligned with the system and it needs to catch up. But
Yeah, no, I think it is the challenge of being a little bit ahead or maybe a lot ahead of
yeah.
something that's moving and maybe we'll catch up.
Yeah. And when we do, so then let's imagine that we're 5, maybe 20 years ahead. If it were up to you, what might the world look like if we're all embracing our inner multi-solvers?
Mm. Well, one thing I feel very convinced about is it's much easier actually to work with the interconnection of the world than it is to fight it. Like, I think a lot of our exhaustion, pain, suffering is because we're trying to use systems that ignore reality, divide it up into parts when it's whole and interconnected. So I think there will be actually ease and uh, the playfulness that you mentioned as two hallmarks of adjusting our systems to fit into the living earth in a better way and to fit with one another in a better way. Um, and I think we have left this transformation so far that I don't think it's just going to be ease and joy and sparkling rainbows. Like there's a lot of damage and harm and loss. Some things are going to be lost forever. Some are here now, but not for much longer. Um, and uh, so I don't see, a world without shocks and suffering and hardship, but I do see the potential that we embrace that and each other in a way that has a lot more meaning and brings relatively more of us relatively more safely through it.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, it is the dark side of transformation. Um, we could just simply relate to one another as brothers and sisters and try and make a better world. We could, but we don't. So, so that means we necessarily have to go through the pain because as I mentioned the word compassion from Latin, passion is pain, patience, and pleasure. So in the
Mhm.
etymology, it's all of those. And com means with one another. So we have to go through the pain and through the pleasure and in order to get to the transformation together. And it's until we realize that that's not necessary, we will keep going through it because what it actually does is it brings us together. Unfortunately, grief unites. Grief brings us to a place where we can listen, when we can slow down. And, you know, I wish it weren't so, but unless we really appreciate it while it's there, we're going to have to grieve it when it's no longer there. And it's the same kind of energy. It's just, it feels
Yeah.
like so unnecessary, but it's what it is. What
Well, I
is,
do think
yeah,
one choice that we do have is whether we're going to honor the losses by trying to learn the lessons or to try to prevent ourselves from feeling the pain of the losses to just try what we've been trying harder. I mean, that's where I see the majority of, mainstream government and businesses going right now, right? Is climate change is encroaching, and so we're building walls, or we're worried about migrants, and we're trying to protect our borders. So that's responding to a crisis from the same way of thinking that created it. And the people that I, learn from the most and admire the most are flipping that, right? With this humility of um, acceptance that whatever we don't know exactly what to do, but we know that what we've been doing isn't working, so let's try other things. And this, so we were talking about courage earlier. There's another form of courage, I think, that we all need to cultivate more.
what is the question we need to ask in order to do that?
One of my teachers is Joanna Macy. Do you know her work?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, she calls it the work that reconnects.
Yes.
One question she says, and she draws this from mythology, I think, is what ails you, actually, as the question. Uh, like, I think maybe we're just so scared to ask what's wrong because we sort of know it's deep at the heart of things. Um, uh, so what ails you or what do you need? And you is all the yous, right? It's the river, the atmosphere, the forest, as well as our neighbor, uh, our colleague, our daughters. Um,
Yeah.
and in
I'm
my
going to add
training,
the work of Macy to the show notes
yeah,
so that people can find it because it's yeah, it's very true. And the interesting thing about her work is that it's circular, right? So if you missed it, you're going to end up there again.
yeah,
You know, you have to address that and that question, what ails you,
yeah.
leads you to
And
dig
and
deeper.
her work is needed now, more than ever. I actually got to know Joanna, well, almost 20 years ago. We talked about me being a scientist. I was giving talks about climate change and in church basements and community rooms and schools. And um, I was trying to move people to action and I was paralyzing them. People would cry, people would leave the room, people would shut down. And I actually said, I can't keep doing this. Like, I'm not accomplishing what I want to do, which is call more people to action. And I put that talk on hold. I said, I'm not going to do this until I find a different way to do it. And that led me to Joanna. I got invited to a month-long retreat off the coast of Oregon with Joanna and her husband Fran and 25 people from around the world. And what Joanna teaches you to do is to experience your pain for the world.
Yeah.
And what I learned was I had my own unprocessed pain, and there was no way I could invite others into action, but without having addressed my own
Yes.
sense of fear and grief and anger. So I've incorporated what I learned from Joanna into my life. It's probably the only reason 25 years later I'm still able to do this work. So
Yeah.
yeah, putting that in the show notes is a great idea.
Yes, I will. Okay. Beth, thank you so much for your wisdom, for your work, for teaching us different ways of relating to each other that are solution oriented at that as well, and concrete and really bringing us the multi-solving that the world needs. So thank you so much for sharing your views today and being with us.
Oh, thank you. And I've learned a lot, and I'm going to think more about design. So I hope we can stay in touch.
Sure, happy to share anything and look for ways to multi-solve together.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Okay.